You are losing something right now. Not money, not time in the way people mean when they say they're busy. Something more irreversible than that. You are losing the specific, unrepeatable hours of your actual life. And the way you are losing them does not look like loss. It looks like responsibility. It looks like being needed. It looks like having a full calendar and a sense of forward motion and the constant sensation that you are almost about to get to the part where you actually start living. That sensation is the trap. 2,000 years ago, a Roman philosopher named Lucius Annaeus Seneca watched the most powerful men in the world, senators, generals, emperors, pursue wealth, status, and influence with everything they had. He watched them win. He watched them reach the apex of what any human being could achieve in the ancient world. And what he observed, from inside the court of Nero, surrounded by people who had won every game the world offered, was this. Almost none of them had actually lived. They had been enormously busy. They had been enormously successful. They had accumulated everything a life could accumulate. And they arrived at the end, having spent the only resource that cannot be earned back. And they spent it on almost everything except the thing that mattered. Seneca spent years mapping exactly how this happens, not why people fail, why people succeed at the wrong game entirely. On the Shortness of Life and the letters to Lucilius, he identified 5 specific moves. Not abstract virtues, not philosophical principles, but precise operational rules that separate the person who actually plays their life from the person who watches it pass from the inside. This video will give you those 5 moves, not as inspiration, as a map. Because here is what Seneca understood that almost no one talks about. The game of life has rules, specific ones. And the reason most people lose is not that they lack talent, drive, or opportunity. It is that they have been playing the wrong game with absolute seriousness, and they will not realize it until it is too late to play a different one. The first move is the one that changes everything else, and it starts with something you give away every single day without noticing. Watch the people around you, the ones who seem perpetually occupied, always behind, always in the middle of something urgent. They check their phone before they have finished their first cup of coffee. They respond to messages on their way to doing something they were already late for. They say, "I've been so busy," the way other people say, "I'm fine," automatically, without thinking, as a kind of identity. Now notice something more specific. None of them chose to be this way. They did not sit down one morning and decide to spend their lives at the mercy of other people's needs. They simply never decided otherwise. And the absence of that decision, the failure to claim the hours before someone else did, is how a life disappears. Seneca, writing to his friend Lucilius sometime around 65 AD, opened the very first of his letters with an injunction so direct it still lands like cold water. Claim your time for yourself, Lucilius. Snatch it back. The time that until now has been taken from you, stolen from you, or simply slipped away. He then made a distinction that most people never make. There is time that is taken from you by other people's demands, obligations, the machinery of social life. And there is time that simply vanishes because you were not paying enough attention to notice it passing. The first theft is obvious. The second is invisible, and therefore far more total. What Seneca observed, with the clinical precision of someone who had watched the most powerful men in Rome work themselves to death in pursuit of more power, was that human beings guard money with extraordinary ferocity and give time away without a second thought. On the Shortness of Life, he names this directly. We clutch our property with closed fists while dividing our lives freely among anyone who asks. A stranger who reached into your pocket would be confronted immediately. A meeting that takes 2 hours of your life for no reason you can articulate will be scheduled again next week, without complaint. The practical move here is not a time management system. Seneca is not interested in efficiency. The move is a single shift in how you categorize what is happening when someone asks for your attention. You are not being asked for your time. You are being asked for a portion of your life. Those are not the same thing. Time is abstract. Life is finite. Once you feel the difference, not just intellectually, but in your body, in the slight resistance that surfaces when something is being taken, you begin to make different decisions without needing a rule to tell you what to do. Start with the small losses, because they are where most of the bleeding happens. The conversation that could have been 2 sentences and lasted 30 minutes. The obligation you said yes to because refusing felt harder than surrendering the afternoon. The hour you spent not quite resting and not quite working, in that grey zone where nothing accumulates. Seneca calls this time that is neither taken nor given, but simply lost. And he argues it is the most dangerous category because no one can even name what took it. The next step asks you to go further, to look not just at where time goes, but at what, inside you, decides how it's spent. That distinction is the hinge that everything else turns on. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. Suppression is not removal. Every hour you spend worrying about a result you cannot control, a person whose opinion you cannot determine, a future you cannot guarantee, that hour does not go toward solving those problems. It goes toward nothing. It evaporates, and the problems remain exactly as they were, now accompanied by your exhaustion. Seneca watched this dynamic consume the most capable people he had ever known. In the letters to Lucilius, he describes a particular kind of suffering that has nothing to do with actual circumstances. A man tormented not by what is happening, but by what might happen, by what other people are thinking, by outcomes that belong entirely to forces outside his reach. It is not the things themselves that disturb men, Seneca writes, but the opinions and fancies they form about things. The suffering is real, but the object of the suffering is imaginary, a projection into territory the mind does not own. This is the second move, and it is more demanding than the first, because it asks you to do something that feels like giving up. To stop investing energy in variables you cannot influence, not to stop caring, to stop spending. There is a difference between caring about an outcome and pouring your limited cognitive resources into something that does not respond to attention. One is natural, the other is a leak. The Stoic distinction, the one Seneca returned to across dozens of letters, is between what is up to us and what is not. What is up to us, how we respond, what we choose to pursue, the quality of attention we bring to the present moment, whether we act with integrity or abandon it under pressure. What is not, how others receive what we do, whether fortune cooperates, the verdict that comes after the effort. Most people spend most of their energy on the second list while running the first on autopilot. The result is not failure. It is a specific kind of exhaustion that has no name because the person experiencing it cannot locate its source. The practice Seneca suggests is not passive, it is surgical. At the start of any day where you feel the particular weight of anxiety, the low-grade dread that has no single cause, ask one question. Is what I am anxious about something I can actually affect with today's choices? Not eventually. Today. If yes, the anxiety has a use. It points toward action. If no, you are spending yourself on a problem that will not accept the payment. Identify it, name it, then redirect. This is not optimism. Seneca was not optimistic about the world. He watched Nero. He understood what institutions can do to individuals when power is unaccountable and cruelty is convenient. The distinction between what is and isn't in your control is not a way of pretending the world is safer than it is. It is a way of not being destroyed by the parts of it you cannot change. so that you have full force available for the parts you can. What makes this difficult is that the line between the two categories is rarely obvious in real time. Anxiety blurs it deliberately. When you are convinced that something depends on you, you cannot see clearly whether it actually does. Seneca's corrective is slow and requires practice. You must repeatedly catch yourself mid-investment and ask what, specifically, you are trying to influence. If you cannot name the mechanism, if you cannot trace how your current mental effort translates into a real-world lever, you are probably outside your territory. The next step sharpens this further, because knowing where your control ends is only half the equation. The other half is what you do with the moments when everything outside your control arrives at once, and you were not ready. Picture the moment when everything goes wrong at once, not a hypothetical. The specific version that belongs to your life, the relationship that fractures, the project that collapses, the diagnosis that arrives without warning, the morning you wake up, and the structure you had built is simply gone. Most people, when they imagine this moment, believe they will rise to meet it. They believe that when something truly serious arrives, some deeper version of themselves will surface, steadier, clearer, more capable than the everyday self. Seneca spent years watching what actually happens. What actually happens is the opposite. People do not rise to the occasion of adversity. They fall to the level of their preparation for it. The person who arrives at a crisis, already exhausted, already without a framework for suffering, already convinced that difficulty is a sign something has gone wrong rather than a feature of the game. That person does not discover hidden reserves. They discover that they have none. The crisis does not reveal character. It reveals whatever was already there. What Seneca developed in response to this, across multiple letters to Lucilius and woven throughout on the shortness of life, is what he called the practice of anticipation, not worry, not catastrophizing, something more deliberate. The daily, systematic meditation on the worst version of what could happen, entered voluntarily, in a calm state, before any of it arrives. He recommended spending a portion of each day imagining the loss of what you most depend on: health, comfort, relationships, status. Not to produce despair, but to produce familiarity. When you have already sat with the thing you fear, the fear changes shape. It does not disappear. It becomes something you recognize rather than something that blindsides you. The practical form of this is precise. At the end of the day, not in the anxious middle of it, but after the work is done, take one thing you are currently depending on and ask what your life looks like without it. Not dramatically, clinically. You are not predicting loss. You are practicing it, the way a surgeon practices a procedure before the operation. The goal is not to manufacture suffering in advance. The goal is to arrive at the actual moment of difficulty already having been there once in your mind. Steady, because you have rehearsed steadiness, not because the situation warrants it. Seneca distinguishes this practice sharply from fear. Fear is involuntary anticipation of bad outcomes, running on its own rhythm, answering to nothing. The premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of adversity, is its controlled inversion. You choose the object, you choose the duration, you choose when to return from it. What fear does to you, this practice lets you do to fear. It does not eliminate pain. It eliminates the additional suffering that comes from having never considered that pain was possible. In letter 91 of the letters to Lucilius, describing the sudden destruction of an entire city by fire, Seneca makes the point with characteristic bluntness. The people who survived with their minds intact were not the ones with better circumstances. They were the ones who had never allowed themselves the fantasy that disaster was something that happened to other people. Preparation does not soften grief. It keeps grief from becoming collapse. The fourth step draws from the same source, but it asks you to look not inward at your own resilience, but outward at the specific people you have let into your life. Because what Seneca understood about adversity, he understood equally about companionship. You do not become who you want to be alone. You become who the people around you make it easier to be. If what you're hearing resonates with you, you'll find real value in my ebooks. Beyond the Shadow breaks down Jung's core ideas, while Dialogues with the Unconscious gives you a 30-day path to apply them in your life. Both are linked in the pinned comment. There is a particular kind of person most people keep in their lives without ever examining why. Not because they are useful, not because the relationship is deep or nourishing or built on anything that could withstand real scrutiny, but because they are easy, because they never ask too much, because around them you never have to become anyone different from who you already are. And that comfort, which you have mistaken for compatibility, is quietly confirming you in place. Seneca identified this dynamic with a precision that is uncomfortable to sit with. In Letter 7 of the Letters to Lucilius, he writes, "Associate with those who will make you a better person. Admit those who you yourself can make better." Not as a social strategy, as a matter of survival. His argument was architectural. The people you spend time with do not merely accompany your development, they determine its upper ceiling. Not because they impose limits, but because proximity creates calibration. You adjust, unconsciously, to what the people around you treat as normal. Their ambitions become the reference point for yours. Their tolerance for mediocrity slowly renegotiates yours. This is not about cutting people off. Seneca was not cold, and his writing on friendship is among the warmest in the philosophical tradition. What he was precise about was the difference between two categories of relationship, those that confirm you in your current shape, and those that make your current shape harder to maintain. The first category is comfortable. The second is uncomfortable in a specific way. The way standing next to someone who is genuinely better than you at living makes you aware, in your body, of the gap between who you are and who you could be. That discomfort is the point. Seneca recommended something concrete. Identify one person, living, historical, real, or reconstructed from their work, whose way of moving through the world you genuinely admire, not their achievements, their character under pressure, and then use them as a presence. Before a decision that requires more of you than you currently feel capable of, ask not what you want to do, but what that person would recognize as worthy. The question is not rhetorical. It produces actual answers that differ from the ones your comfort would generate. What this practice does over time is move your internal reference point. You stop measuring yourself against the average of your immediate environment and start measuring against a standard you chose deliberately. Seneca called this finding someone to venerate, and he believed that the person who finds such a model becomes gradually venerable themselves. Not because admiration is contagious, because sustained contact with a higher standard, even an imagined one, makes your lower defaults increasingly difficult to inhabit without noticing. The fifth step closes the map. It returns everything, time, control, preparation, relationship, to the one territory where all of it either works or doesn't, the single day in front of you, and what you are actually doing with it. You have done this thousands of times without noticing. You have moved through an entire day, not inattentively, not carelessly, but with genuine effort, genuine focus, and arrived at the end of it feeling that the real day, the one that counted, was still ahead, that today was preparation, that you were building toward something that would eventually justify all of this. The job, the relationship, the discipline, the sacrifice, the waiting. Seneca watched this pattern consume the people around him with the same efficiency it consumed the hours. In On the Shortness of Life, he describes a particular kind of man, one he clearly recognized from his years at the center of Roman power. who spent his entire life preparing to live, who said, with genuine conviction, that after his 50th year, he would withdraw to what he actually wanted, that his 60th would release him from obligation, that the real chapter was coming. And then, with surgical precision, Seneca asks the question that the man never thought to ask himself. What guarantee do you have that your life will extend that far? And if it does, what makes you think you will arrive at that future with the mind you needed to enjoy it, rather than the mind you built by spending decades postponing everything that mattered? This is not a warning about death. It is a warning about a specific kind of living that disguises itself as responsibility. The move Seneca prescribes, across Letter 32, Letter 101, and the closing sections of On the Shortness of Life, is precise and demanding. Treat each day as a complete unit of life, not as a corridor, not as installment, not as investment, a complete thing, with its own beginning and end, its own weight, its own claim on your attention. This does not mean ignoring tomorrow. It means refusing to let tomorrow consume today. It means asking, at the end of each evening, not what you produced, but what you actually inhabited, where your attention was fully present. What happened that you were conscious enough to receive? The distinction Seneca draws is between existing and living, and he draws it with the directness of someone who watched powerful men exist enormously without living at all. He has a phrase for those who spend years accumulating the trappings of a life while being absent from the life itself. They did not live long, he says. They existed long. The man who lived in the present, who treated each day with the gravity it deserved, who did not defer his real life to a future that might not cooperate. That man, whether he died at 40 or at 90, lived more than the man who survived to 100 while spending the entire time waiting for it to begin. The practice is not romantic. It is an act of auditing. Tonight, before sleep, do not review your productivity. Review your presence. Name 1 hour from today where you were actually there, not managing the hour, not moving through it towards something else, but there. Then name 1 hour that vanished while you were looking the other way, not to generate guilt, to generate data, because the person who cannot name where their hours went is not living deliberately. They are living by default. And default, as Seneca understood better than almost anyone, is how a life disappears. The map is complete, 5 moves. But knowing them and playing them are not the same thing. And Seneca knew that too. What he understood, watching the most accomplished people in the ancient world fail to live their own lives, is that the final obstacle is never information. It is the confrontation with what the information requires you to change. Most people, when they reach the end of a video like this, want a summary, a clean list, something to screenshot and save and never return to. What Seneca would say about that impulse is not flattering, and it is probably the most useful thing in everything you have just watched. The 5 moves in this video are not a system. They are not a productivity framework dressed in philosophical clothing. They are a diagnosis of the specific way a human life unravels, not through catastrophe, but through the quiet accumulation of days that were never quite claimed. Time surrendered without accounting. Energy spent on variables that don't respond to it. Adversity arrived at unprepared. Company that made smallness comfortable. Days passed through rather than inhabited. None of these failures announce themselves. They look, from the inside, exactly like being responsible, like being realistic, like being a good person who is getting to the real part of their life very soon. Seneca knew what that looked like from the outside. He watched it in the men who ran the Roman Empire. Men who had won every competition the world offered and arrived at the end, having spent the only resource that cannot be recovered. In the final pages of On the Shortness of Life, he asks Paulinus, the friend to whom the entire essay is addressed, a question so direct It has not aged a single day in 2,000 years. He asks him to consider how much of his life, when examined honestly, actually belonged to him. Not to his obligations, not to his reputation, not to the demands of people who would replace him without ceremony the moment he was gone. To him. The fraction, Seneca implies, will be smaller than he expects. That question belongs to you now, not as an abstraction, not as something to think about later when you have more time to think, which is itself the trap. Right now, before the screen goes dark, before the next thing takes the attention this one is releasing, what portion of the hours you have lived so far were genuinely, deliberately yours? Not the hours you filled, the hours you chose, the hours that, if they were the last ones, you would not need to apologize for. The answer to that question is not comfortable, but discomfort that produces clarity is the most useful thing Seneca ever offered, and it is, in the end, the only move that makes the other 5 possible. If what you found here is the kind of thing you want more of, the video on your screen right now goes further. Click and keep going.